Hi guys, welcome back to Code Master Coach, your medical coding tutor. Guys, we're still continuing our review of the 2024 official ICD-10-CM coding guidelines. Okay, let's finish up where we stopped last week. We were on part 13 today. Okay. In chapter 13, we're on diseases of the musculoskeletal system and connective tissue. These codes are in the M00 through M99 categories. We start with A, site and laterality. Site, where, laterality, right or left. So let's go to the guidelines. The guidelines state that most of the codes within chapter 13 have site and laterality designations. The site represents the bone, joint, or the muscle involved. For some conditions where more than one bone, joint, or muscle is usually involved, such as with osteoarthritis, there is a multiples sites code available. For categories where no multiple site code is provided and more than one bone, joint, or muscle is involved, then multiple codes should be used to indicate the different sites involved. Okay, let's go back to the handout, straight from the guideline. Number 1, bone versus joint. For certain conditions, the bone may be affected at the upper or lower end, and though the portion of the bone affected may be at the joint, the site designation will be the bone and not the joint. Okay, the site designation will be the bone and not the joint. All right, B, acute traumatic versus chronic or recurrent musculoskeletal conditions. A new, something that just happened, an acute traumatic versus one that you've had for a while, or one that's come back again, musculoskeletal condition. It says refer to the guideline. Okay, we're at B. Many musculoskeletal conditions are a result of a previous injury or trauma to a site, or they're a reoccurring condition. Bone, joint, or muscle conditions that are the result of a healed injury are usually found in chapter 13. Recurrent bone, joint, or muscle conditions are also usually found in chapter 13. Any current or an acute injury should be coded to the appropriate injury code from chapter 19. Chronic or recurrent conditions should generally be coded with the code from chapter 13. So if it's difficult to determine from the documentation in the record which code is best to describe a condition, then query the provider. But just keep in mind, old or reoccurrent, chapter 13, but a new injury or a new condition is chapter 19. All right, let's go to C, coding of a pathologic fracture. So first, I got a couple of notes here. My first note, a pathologic fracture is a broken bone that's caused by weakened or unhealthy bone tissue rather than injury. So understand that usually in your elderly, due to their vitamin D deficiency, their bones tend to weaken and they end up with osteoporosis or other conditions that can weaken the bones. And because of the weakness of the bones, a lot of times these patients will go in and not even know that their arm is broken. But because it's a pathologic fracture, because of other illnesses or conditions in the body that weaken the bones are easy to break. That's considered a pathological fracture. So I have another note, my purple note, which is a Code Master Coach note, which is just something that I recommend. It's not a rule. Make sure to highlight the 2 different types of fracture in your alphabetic index. I'm going to show you a picture of what I'm talking about. But just know that when it comes to fracture coding, that the default is traumatic. It's automatically assumed that if a patient comes in with a fracture, that there was some type of injury. Something happened. They fell. They got hit. Something caused that fracture, unless it's a pathologic fracture. So in your alphabetic index, this is a copy of my 2024 ICD-10-CM alphabetic index, and I just went to the main term fracture, and notice right beside it, this one says pathological. So this is where you'll code your pathologic fractures. But over here, the very next page, this is page 186. If you go to page 187, the very next page, main term fracture, it's a little blurry. If you come down right there, it says traumatic. So there's the two different types of fractures. Pathologic, weakened bones due to a disease process, or fractured bones due to some type of trauma. And you'll get to the point where you almost learn these codes or know them. When I see an M code, I automatically know it's a pathological fracture. And when I see the S code, I know that it's a some type of traumatic fracture. Okay? You'll get to learn your different types of fractures. All right, and it's going into seventh character A versus D. So let's go back to the guidelines. Coding of pathologic fractures. The seventh character A, let me show you, is for the use as long as the patient is receiving active treatment. Let me show you that, because this is where a lot of students make mistakes. This is a copy of the tabular list. And I just went to the M80s because that's where we're talking about osteoporosis, etc., with pathological fractures. And this is where your seventh character designation comes in. Now notice you have a choice of A, D, G, K, P, or S. In E&M, when you think of, in CPT, when you think of initial, you think of first visit. When you think of subsequent, you think of the next day or the day after. But that rule does not apply when it comes to fractures. Because again, your outline says the seventh character A is for use as long as the patient is receiving active treatment for the fracture. While the patient may be seen by a new or a different provider over the course of treatment for a pathological fracture, assignment of the seventh character is based on whether the patient is undergoing active treatment and not whether the provider is seeing the patient for the first time. Let me say that one more time. The assignment of the seventh character is based on whether the patient is undergoing active treatment. So it might take 2 or 3 visits for active treatment. It will still be the initial, and not whether the provider is seeing the patient for the first time. Now, the seventh character D is to be used for encounters after the patient has completed active treatment for the fracture and is now receiving routine care for the fracture during the healing or the recovery phase. And then the other 7 characters listed under each subcategory in the tabular list are to be used for subsequent encounters for treatment of problems associated with the healing, such as malunion, non-union, or a sequela. And let me show you that again on this 7th character. Remember, the A is for the initial or for as long as they're receiving active treatment. But it says D and the others are subsequent, no longer receiving active treatment, but are receiving routine care for routine healing, for delayed healing, for non-union. The bones didn't come back together as they should and instead might be a little off, or malunion. Either they didn't come together or they need to be broken and put back in place again. And then we know a sequela is like a residue, the result of what's left after. Okay, make sure I covered that. Care for complications of surgical treatment for fracture repairs during the healing or recovery phase should be coded with the appropriate complication codes. So again, if it's a complication, you should be under main term complication. All right, let's see what the outline says. Osteoporosis, straight from the guidelines. Number one, first let's say osteoporosis is a systemic condition, meaning that all bones of the musculoskeletal system are affected. If you got osteoporosis, it's in your bone. Therefore, the site is not a component of the codes under category M81, osteoporosis without a current pathological fracture. The site codes under category M80, osteoporosis with a current pathological fracture, identify the site of the fracture and not the osteoporosis, because again, by this time the fracture takes precedence over the osteoporosis. So, number one says osteoporosis without a pathological fracture. Category M81, osteoporosis without a current pathological fracture, is for use for patients with osteoporosis who do not currently have a pathological fracture due to the osteoporosis, even if they've had a fracture in the past. And for patients with a history of osteoporosis fractures, the status code Z87.310, personal history of a healed osteoporosis fracture, should follow the code from M81. So again, you're coding the osteoporosis M81, but you're identifying the fact that the patient had a history of it, but they don't have a fracture today. Whereas, let me see if number two, I'll make sure my number two, straight from the guidelines, okay? Number two, if you have osteoporosis with a current pathological fracture, category M80, osteoporosis with current pathological fracture, is for patients who have a current pathological fracture at the time of an encounter. The codes under M80 identify the site of the fracture, and a code from category M80, not a traumatic fracture code, should be used for any patient with known osteoporosis who suffers a fracture, even if the patient had a minor fall or trauma, if that fall or trauma would not usually break a normal, healthy bone. So again, the mind thought is pathological. There's not a fall or any kind of trauma. It's due to the disease state in the body that's weakened the bone. However, if the patient does have a fracture and they might have had a minor fall, they're saying that fall would not normally break a healthy bone, but because of the osteoporosis and the weakened state of this patient's bones, then this fracture is an pathological fracture. And I always tell my students, make sure your physician states pathological fracture. We don't code them just based on our knowledge. We need to know, is it a traumatic fracture or is it a pathological fracture? The default is traumatic. If the physician does not say pathological fracture, do not code it as a pathological fracture. You automatically, the default is traumatic. All right, I think I've drilled that in your heads enough. Let's keep going. Oh, that's it. Next week, chapter 14. Let me make sure this is what the guideline says. Yep, that's it. Next week, we're on chapter 14. Okay, guys, that's it. I hope these guidelines are helping you to understand the process a little more. But again, fracture, think of a broken bone. Is the bone broken because of a disease process of the patient that's caused the bones to weaken and therefore break? And if so, and your physician states it, that's a pathological fracture. Otherwise, it's considered to be traumatic. It's understood there was a fall or something, some type of injury that broke the bone. That's a traumatic fracture. However, that last guideline said, even if the patient had a minor fall, if it's a fall that would not have normally broken an arm or a bone, but because of the disease state of the patient and it's weakened the bones and it fractured the bones, it can still be a pathological fracture, but you just need your physician to state that. All right, guys, thanks for following along. I'll be back next week and we'll be on chapter 14.